It's a couple of minutes after, and we don't have anybody else in the waiting room right now. So
Okay.
we're ready to get started.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope all is staying well and everybody's families are safe. Again, welcome to the RCI Boost Your Business webinar series. And we just wanted to first let me thank my staff, Emily and James, for taking the lead on this, on putting some very good webinars and topics together from you all. And if you all need to have, please provide us suggestions that you would like for us to try to reach out and find some industry speakers. And this is one of the topics that we know we want to make people understand is that people had a hard time trying to navigate that entire PPP system early on. And so we got feedback from individuals. So we wanted to put a webinar on to get as many diverse businesses out there. And so we reached out to one of our top SBA lending banks, Enterprise Bank. We've been affiliated with Enterprise Bank since at least 2005. They are one of the region's top SBA lenders. They know SBA lending. They only focus on entrepreneurs. And I want to introduce to you, well, under the format, James will be following up with any questions throughout this throughout this webinar. So if you want to send things out, if you chat the questions, James will be asking those questions to Dave. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dave Miller, Senior VP of Enterprise Bank.
Thank you, Juan. Appreciate it. Good morning to everybody. Echoing Juan's comments, everybody is staying safe, doing well, being healthy. So yeah, what I wanted to do for the group today is talk about the PPP program. We're in a little bit of a hiatus right now between funding allocations. As many of you may know, the initial tranche of government funding for the Paycheck Protection Program was just shy of $350 billion. And that funding round ran out actually a little more than a week ago, last Thursday morning. So Congress and the president have been working over the last week to approve new legislation to refund the program, because a lot of small businesses, weren't able to receive their funding or even approvals from the SBA before the initial tranche of money ran out. So there is a new stimulus bill that has been signed by the Senate and, as of yesterday, the House. And my understanding is the president will be signing that today. And the latest that I've heard, and this is not definitive, but from our SBA lending trade organization, is that SBA is expecting to begin accepting applications under the second funding round first thing Monday morning. So most of the bankers in the market will be enjoying their weekend, and it'll be nose to the grindstone again on Monday if that time frame comes to fruition. This second stimulus package totals $484 billion and includes some other initiatives beyond the Paycheck Protection Program itself, but the PPP program is expected to get $310 billion for that in the next round of funding. So let me talk, I might work a little bit in reverse here. What has been happening since last Thursday morning, when the first round of funding ran out, SBA essentially shut down its application portal when the funding was exhausted. So there's been a ton of questions out there. If I applied already, what's my status? Well, the SBA itself essentially shut down the application portal. So there is no SBA specific what's being called loan queue, or there's no waiting list at the SBA itself for pending applications that didn't get served in the first round. The banks themselves, however, most of the ones that I'm in contact with locally have established their own internal queues for their clients or their applicants that they weren't able to submit to the SBA and get funded in the first round. So most every bank that I've talked to, including Enterprise here, we've continued to process PPP applications over the last week internally, having them approved internally and waiting to submit them for funding approval to the SBA. So, if you have already applied with your existing bank, most likely, as long as they've acknowledged receipt of your application, most likely you're in a queue there. You might want to take today to see, to the extent that you can, to try to confirm that with your existing bank. But the way this works with the SBA itself, when the funding opens back up, a business is only eligible for one approval. So whichever bank you apply with that gets into the SBA application portal first for funding is where your loan's going to come from. So I know a lot of businesses are applying at multiple banks, and I totally understand that, and don't fault anyone for doing that. But if you're already in the queue somewhere, whoever gets to you first is essentially where your funding is going to come from. But let's go back to the beginning. What is this program, and what's its intent, and how do you apply for it? So you got to think conceptually about the name of this program. It's the Paycheck Protection Program. So, a lot of business owners, are looking at this program as, is this something that'll help keep my business viable and help me to continue to operate in the same fashion that I did pre-COVID-19? That's really not the intent of the PPP program. It's all focused on payroll and in paying employees, even if they're not actually working because of mandated closures of certain businesses. So Paycheck Protection Program is really about the paycheck. So it's a payroll-driven program. And the way that it works is for an existing business, the SBA, through the banking community who's delivering this program, will look at what was your level of payroll last year before COVID-19 effects came into the economy, and will drive the loan amount based upon a prorated portion of what you paid employees during 2019. Now, there's a few caveats that if you weren't in business in 2019, the bank and the SBA can look at what your employment or payroll payments were in January and February of this year before the pandemic started. Or if you're a seasonal business, there's a provision in there where the SBA and the bank's look back period is based on a snapshot of last year between February 15th and June 30th. So that if you're a seasonal type business, they'll capture that employment or that payroll, those payroll numbers from the same period last year is what we're dealing with now. And that'll help determine your eligible loan amount. So basically the way that the loan amount works, you develop with your bank using payroll records that you have. And the primary payroll record that is being used as supporting documentation for the loan amount under PPP are your quarterly payroll tax returns that you submit to the IRS. The form number is 941. That is the primary supporting payroll document that is to be used to determine your average payroll for 2019 on a monthly basis. And more specifically, it's the Medicare wage line of the 941, which is the most comprehensive number in terms of what gross compensation you as a small business paid to your employees. So you basically take the average monthly payroll you had last year based on the 941 plus any employer contributions towards employee health care or employee retirement. And then there's a few extraneous unique things, like the portion of unemployment compensation that you paid to the state of Pennsylvania, if that applies to your business. But it's basically payroll plus employer portion of health benefits and retirement are the big three. You average that for 2019 on a monthly basis, and then the program has a formula that takes 2.5 times that monthly number to determine your eligible loan amount. And without getting too technical, the 2.5 times multiplier of the average monthly payroll number is based upon the fact that you will have 8 weeks from the time you receive your PPP loan proceeds to spend the money. But you can spend it on primarily payroll, which is what it's designed for, but you can also spend the money on a few other authorized uses that are specific to that law. And those authorized uses are rent and utilities and interest on debt obligations. So the reason that the formula is 2.5 times rather than just 2 times, because you're only spending it for 2 months or 8 weeks, is that extra 0.5 in the formula gives you some extra money to pay rent, utilities, and interest expense on debt. So the first phase of the program is determining the total eligible loan amount based on that formula I just gave you. Now the eligibility for the program is very flexible in terms of in comparison to normal SBA loan programs. In normal SBA lending programs, each industry type has a level of employees or revenue under which it's considered to be small and eligible for SBA financing. They expanded that definition significantly for PPP in that, you can have up to 500 employees among your business and any affiliated businesses and still be eligible for this program. So I know there's a lot going on in the press and a lot of blowback right now about big companies getting this financing. It's the nature of the size standard that was implemented here, which is much larger than what would normally be the target audience for an SBA loan. So I don't think that's obviously going to adversely affect anyone on today's call, or 99% of most small businesses aren't going to get anywhere near that size limitation. A couple of other eligibility requirements. You have to have not caused the loss to the government on any other government-related loans, whether they be SBA loans, government-guaranteed student loans. You have to have not had any felony convictions within the last 5 years. You have to not be currently delinquent on a government loan. You cannot be in bankruptcy proceedings at present. But for the most part, almost all small businesses are eligible for this program. So the way that you access the program is through, a participating lender, and that in and of itself has been expanded significantly under PPP. Normally, you have to have an agreement in place between the bank and the SBA to make normal SBA loans, and you have to go through an approval process to be allowed to provide SBA guaranteed loans. They fast-tracked the addition of a large group of lending institutions that weren't already SBA lenders for this PPP program. We just happen to be one, as Juan mentioned, a bank that has always done a lot of SBA lending. So the banks that were experienced SBA lenders had somewhat of an advantage because we understood the basic mechanics of SBA lending, We had the technology interface with SBA that some of these newer lenders didn't have. But suffice it to say, pretty much every lending institution bank now at this point, I think, is able to provide these PPP loans. Now, with that said, banks have the discretion as to who they offer these loans to. And we were no different. The first round of funding, we prioritized existing clients of the bank first for a couple of reasons. One is we have a vested interest in their financial success already because we have loans to them or we have deposits with them. And secondly, we already have a lot of their information on file. So it allows us to be more efficient with processing loans for existing clients. Fortunately, we were one of the banks, because of our SBA lending expertise, that was able to get all of our existing bank clients funded during the first round of funding before it ran out last Thursday. So we have gotten a lot of inquiries even before the Pittsburgh Business Times article came out from clients of other banks, basically saying that they did not get approved in the first round of funding and their businesses are in jeopardy. So we are willing in enterprise to take applications from non-existing clients under this second phase. With that said, I can't speak for the other banks. I do know most of them have loan queues already established, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, so that if you've already applied, you're likely in one of those queues. In terms of us at Enterprise bringing on new clients, at our core, we want to help. We want to help as many businesses as we can through a very difficult time. But at our core, we're a relationship-driven bank. So we understand in a COVID-19 world, moving all the regular lending and deposit relationships over to a new bank, might be difficult. So all we're asking for is a good faith commitment on behalf of the business owner that once the crisis is over and the PPP loans processed and in place, a good faith effort on behalf of the owner to move their banking and lending with us, because we are relationship driven. And quite honestly, there's a big misnomer out there that the banks are going to make a lot of money on this program. At a 1% interest rate, we're still paying people that opened CDs here a couple of years ago a lot more than 1%. The new money's cheap, but the legacy money that we pay out on interest-bearing deposits, we're not making a lot of money on this program. So what we're looking at it as is a way to build new relationships with businesses coming out of it. So with all that said, I want to walk you very quickly through the application itself. Emily, can you put that up on the screen? Okay, so the form that Emily just put up, there's a single application. It's called the SBA Form 2483. It's basically, there's a lot of disclosure information, but it basically boils down to 2 pages of information to be collected from the client. Pretty simple. The initial information at the top is really just information on the business itself, how it's organized, its EIN number, its name, address, legal name and address, the contact person. The second section, which is where the average monthly payroll, and then that 2.5 times formula, is what is determined based upon, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, your 941 quarterly payroll returns that you submitted to the IRS, plus supporting information for health benefits and retirement benefits paid by you as the employer on your employee's behalf. And then you come up with a loan amount. Quite honestly, the bank's going to double check what your requested loan amount is and your supporting documents. And more often than not, there's a back and forth on what is felt to be the correct loan amount. So it's not uncommon for your bank to come back to you and ask you to amend your average monthly payroll calculation and your loan amount calculation based upon what they calculate to be appropriate, which often is different than what the business owner calculates. Not by much, but there's a, it's really a matter of what's in and what's out, which the banks have all the details on that. The ownership structure, SBA requires that we have information on at least 90% of the ownership of the business when we submit through their online portal. You put the information, you get 2 lines there, and you can add additional sheets if necessary if you have multiple owners. But we need to have ownership that totals at least 90% for the business. Then you get into questions that are specifically about eligibility, starting at the second half of the first page. Now, the way that this form is different than most SBA loan applications under the regular program is to speed things up and make it more efficient. SBA is allowing an authorized representative of the business, a single authorized representative of the business, to answer these questions on behalf of the business and its ownership group. So, that authorized representative has somewhat of a burden of ensuring that the information that they're putting on this application is true and correct. So very quickly, I'm just, question 1 is whether you've been debarred, which essentially means banned from receiving government assistance. That usually only happens if there's been a fraud committed against the government. It also talks about being presently in bankruptcy, which is an exclusion under this program. Second question is about government-related debt, and if you caused a prior loss to the government within the last 7 years, you're not eligible for this PPP program. Question 3 is about other businesses that you control, which are called affiliates in the SBA world, and that really is just to determine the size of not just the applicant business but any affiliated businesses. And again, for most small businesses, you have to provide the information, but it's not going to be a concern because you have up to 500 employee size limit under this program. Number 4 is, have you received an SBA economic injury disaster loan? And the common acronym for that is the EIDL program. And I'll talk very briefly about that just so you know what it is when we're done covering PPP. Then questions 5 and 6 talk about, criminal conviction for any 20% or more owner of the business. And the 2 questions are somewhat interrelated, 5 or 6. With, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you've been convicted of a felony within the last 5 years, or any of the owners of 20% or more have, you're not eligible for this program. Question 7 is probably not going to be an issue for most businesses, but if you are a business that employs individuals who reside overseas, the payroll paid to anyone that does not reside in the U.S. is excluded from the calculations under this program. So question 7 flags the bank to check that out. And then number 8 is if you're a franchise, then you have to be an approved SBA franchise. And the banks have access to an SBA database of who those are. So if you're a franchise business, answering this question affirmatively would have us prompt us to check that. Then you get into page 2, which is nothing more than certifications that, again, the authorized representative of the business would have to complete and sign. And I'm not going to go through all those in detail. You can, really just read them and determine if you can certify to all these things affirmatively, then you've met the eligibility requirements for the program. So it's this form. plus your quarterly 941 payroll records for 2019, the 4 quarterly payroll returns. And then in terms of supporting the expenditures for health benefits and retirement contributions and unemployment, let's back up. Health benefits and retirement contributions, you know, we need to be a little more flexible. There's no specific government form or tax return filing, so we can accept, you know, internal payroll reports. We can accept invoices and canceled checks. Anything that's can reasonably substantiate what you paid on your employee's behalf for health insurance and retirement. Now, when it comes to state unemployment compensation, it's called a UC2, that if you pay unemployment on behalf of your employees to the state of Pennsylvania, you file a quarterly return with the state called a UC2. And we can use that to support you know, unemployment payments you made on your employees' behalf. So it's really not that complicated in terms of the supporting documentation. What's made it complicated is early on in this program, there was very limited guidance from SBA on the types of documentation that would be needed, on how the calculations were to be done. So I think every CPA firm and every law firm and every bank in the country developed its own method of doing these calculations, and it was all over the board. I think it's been refined since the program's first round of funding started on April 3rd, that most banks pretty well know what they need from their clients. Again, we're not expecting any changes that I've seen, at least in the legislation for round 2 funding. So I'm guessing everything will stay the same. If it doesn't, then, you know, the banks will have to get on top of that and advise their clients accordingly. Talk about the EIDL program real quick, and then I'll take questions. So before the Paycheck Protection Program was even conceived, SBA always had a direct loan program called its disaster loan program. And under that program, which was normally designed for businesses that were affected by natural disasters like floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, you know, you could get long-term, low-interest direct funding from the SBA to recover from those natural disasters. When we had the Great Recession in 2008, SBA expanded that program to include what was called economic injury disaster loans, or EIDL loans. And they were first employed when businesses were adversely affected not by a natural disaster, but by the economic fallout from the Great Recession. So they revived that program for COVID-19. It's still available. When I say it's still available, it is part of the same funding appropriations as PPP. So it ran out of money at the same time the PPP program did last Thursday. It will be refunded as well with this next round of funding. But where the EIDL program differs from PPP is EIDL allows businesses to apply for loans for other operating expenses, not related strictly to payroll, rent, utilities. So under EIDL, there's a much wider available use of proceeds than there is under PPP. But the big difference between the two, and I'm glad I caught myself here, is EIDL is a straight loan program. It has very favorable interest rates of 3.75% fixed for the life of the loan, and it can have a term of up to 30 years, but it is a loan that needs to be repaid. And it comes directly from the SBA. So you don't go through a bank to receive an EIDL loan. You apply directly online with the SBA itself. What's different with Paycheck Protection versus EIDL, or any other conventional loan for that, or any other regular SBA loan for that matter, is the Paycheck Protection Program is forgivable. So the second aspect of paycheck protection is the forgiveness aspect. And what I mean by that is if you receive a PPP loan and you use the proceeds strictly for the authorized uses that I discussed earlier, payroll, rent, utilities, interest, and you document all of that, and you spend that during the 8 week, you get 8 weeks after you receive funding to spend the money. If you spend it all on authorized uses and can document that to the bank and to the SBA, that portion of the loan that you spend on authorized uses is forgiven, basically becomes a grant. Anything that you're not able to document appropriately becomes a loan at 1% with a 2-year term. The idea is the vast majority of the funds under this program are going to be forgiven. It's incumbent on the business owner to maintain appropriate documentation to qualify for the forgiveness. But the idea is that these are grants disguised as loans. If you don't use the big question, one of the big questions has been, okay, what if I don't use all the money? If you don't use all the money, you're to return it to the bank at the end of that 8-week period. And you don't just get to keep it as a loan if you don't use it for authorized uses. The only time it's not forgiven and becomes a loan is if you're not able to document things sufficient to meet the SBA requirement. There are provisions, without getting too technical, about you have to at least maintain the same, at least 75% of the number of employees that you had during that 8-week period that you did last year at the same time qualify for forgiveness. You have to pay them at least 75% of what you paid them last year to qualify for the forgiveness. So there are some caveats like that may reduce the amount of the loan that's forgivable. But for the most part, if you bring people back to pre-COVID employment levels and bring those employees back, and it doesn't mean they have to be working, quite honestly. I mean, if you're mandated to close and they can't physically work, this is designed to keep a paycheck coming to people. That's why it's called paycheck protection. So this forgiveness aspect is the second phase of the program that we'll be dealing with 2 months from now. I think that's it for me going through the program. I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. We appreciate you going through the details of the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as the application process. We have a few questions, actually several plus, in our chat box. And you may have covered the details on it, but I guess we can kind of just repeat them as a refresher.
That's fine.
So the first one comes from Lori Rooney. She's asking if we've already submitted an application to a bank during the first appropriation of the funds, and that status is submission to SBA. Is there a new criteria for the second appropriation that will require us to resubmit the application?
I have not seen, and again, all I can rely on is the legislation itself for the round 2 funding. And in reading that, I did not see anything in there that would necessitate new application forms or resubmission of an existing application. But between now and what I understand will be Monday morning's official reopening of the program, SBA will have the discretion to make changes it deems necessary. So I don't expect any, but the possibility is always there. So I'll answer the question this way. Assuming there's no changes to the forms or the eligibility, you would not need to reapply. I would confirm with your bank that you applied with that you are in their queue, but I would not see a need based on what I've seen so far that there would need to be a new application.
Thank you, Dave. The following question comes from Nikki Henk. She asks, as a self-employed individual, how much am I allowed to borrow?
Okay, so I'm glad that question came up because the business owners themselves and self-employed are not shut out of this program. I'll answer the question in a couple of different ways, not knowing how this particular individual is organized. So if you are a sole proprietor, and you therefore file a Schedule C to your tax return every year, and you may receive your income, your gross income, either from operating a sole proprietorship business, or you might receive 1099 income as a contractor that is working for someone else. Under either of those scenarios, you would file a Schedule C, and after you deduct the expenses of running your business or your self-employment circumstance, whatever that net profit is that you had in 2019 is what SBA considers to be your income personally as the owner. So you would take that 2019 net profit number, divide it by 12 to come up with an average monthly, and multiply that times 2.5. And that is how much a self-employed individual would be eligible to receive under the PPP loan program.
Thanks, Dave. That was a very detailed answer. I think we can move forward with the next question. This question comes from Paula Cantani. She's asking, are there any requirements that have been established for reporting on the use of funds? And do you need invoices to support rent? And what constitutes a utility?
Okay. So that second aspect of the PPP program, which is the forgiveness aspect, is still the area where we as lenders are still seeking guidance from the SBA. The enacting legislation, which was the CARES Act, that was passed on March the 27th, specifically provided that SBA would have 30 days from the date of enactment of that law to issue detailed guidance on forgiveness. So that essentially gives them until April 27th, which is Monday, to issue more detailed guidance on the forgiveness aspect of the program. So all we have on that forgiveness as guidance right now is the actual law itself. So what we're telling our clients in advance of getting more detailed guidance, which we expect within the next couple of days, is document everything. I do know that absent some other guidance with regard to rent, we're going to require here at Enterprise a copy of the lease itself, and that lease needs to have been entered into prior to February 15th of this year, which is considered to be when COVID really started to adversely affect the economy. We're going to require a copy of the lease, and we're going to require a canceled check to show that the rent's paid for the 2 months under that lease tie-in. With regard to utilities, I don't have it off the top of my head, but there is a specific list of what is considered to be utilities beyond the standard gas, electric, water, sewage. I do know internet access was included there and considered to be a utility cost, and a couple of other things. I can send, if there's a way that you or Emily have a way to get information out to the attendees, I can find that and get that out.
Yes, we can do that. We can do that. Paula had one more question, or a few to kind of follow that. And those that follow were, how will this work for 1099 contractors that are used on a consistent basis? For example, I own an advertising agency, and we have a period of about a week and a half every month where we get extremely busy getting commercials produced and using freelance editors to pick up the slack. Can these funds be used to maintain the relationship with these contractors?
Nah, so this is something that's unique with the PPP program. So payroll, true payroll, meaning employee compensation, is eligible for inclusion both in the determining the loan amount for a PPP loan and for forgiveness later. If you pay individuals as 1099 contractors, you as the business that are paying them do not include their payments in your PPP loan. they themselves are eligible as self-employed individuals receiving 1099 income to apply on their own for their own PPP loan.
Thank you, Dave. Our next question comes from Tina Daniels, and she's asking, can you count the salary you pay yourself for this loan?
Yes. It has to be documented in a couple of different ways. So depending on what type of entity you are, if you are a corporation and you're paying yourself as an owner, as a W-2 employee, just like your other employees, there's no difference between you being paid as the owner of the company and your other employees if you're paid as a W-2. The only limitation is, and I should have mentioned this early on, any individual employee wages, whether it's to the owner or a regular employee, that exceed $100,000 on an annual basis, for purposes of the program, are reduced to $100,000. So essentially, nobody can receive loan proceeds to pay themselves more than $100,000 annualized over an 8-week prorated period. So if you pay yourself W-2 as the owner, you're not looked at any differently than other employees. If you pay yourself through distributions or draws, then the burden of proof or the supporting paperwork that's used to determine what you get paid is your self-employment earnings on the K-1 that you receive from your business as an owner. So if you're W-2, it's handled just like another employee, subject to the $100,000 limit. If you're paid through distributions, it's based on your K-1, also subject to the $100,000 limit.
Thanks, Dave. Our next question comes from Lori Rooney. She's asking, is health insurance payments included in what you can actually spend the money on?
Yes, the employer portion of health, in other words, health benefit payments made by the employer on the employee's behalf are eligible in determining the actual loan amount that you're eligible for, and are also eligible uses for forgiveness in terms of what you use the money for.
Okay. Tina has one more question to kind of follow up the one she had asked prior to, and it is, are banks paid a processing fee based on the amount of loan they process? And will this cause banks to focus on processing larger loans?
Yes, because as I mentioned, that interest rate, essentially doesn't allow any margin for the bank. SBA is going to. Now, we haven't received any money yet, nor do we even know what the process will be, but SBA will be paying the banks themselves a fee that is a percentage of the loan amount, anywhere from 1% to 5%. But the 5% is on the smallest loans up to $350,000. From $350,000 to $2 million, it's 3%, and loans over $2 million, it's 1%. So SBA did make it more enticing from a percentage fee basis for the banks to do the smallest loans and help the greatest number of businesses. It is a little unique. If you get close to that $350,000 number, the bank can actually make more on a smaller loan than one that's just over 350, where it drops from 5 to 3%.
Okay. Our next question comes from Caroline Martin, and she's asking, can you apply if you owe taxes that are currently on a payment plan?
If they're under a payment plan that is recognized by the taxing body, then you're eligible. And again, the only type of tax issues we're talking about, because this is a federal program, are federal tax. So if they're state, local, real estate, that doesn't have any bearing. If they're federal taxes and they're delinquent, as long as you're under a recognized payment program with the federal government, you're eligible.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Tina Daniels has another question to follow. So she says, 2019 tax filing deadline has been extended to 7/15/2020. Is it mandatory to have your completed 2019 tax information to apply for the PPP loan?
Only if, let me qualify that. No, because remember, the payroll, supporting documents for payroll are the quarterly 941 payroll returns that you would have submitted each quarter of 2019. That's not your income tax return for 2019. So the only time that a 2019 income tax return is quasi-required is if you are a sole proprietor. You don't need to file your 2019 taxes, but you need to submit a pro forma Schedule C for 2019, because that's how the loan amount is determined for sole proprietorship. So you would work with your accountant to do a pro forma 2019 Schedule C to submit with your PPP app. But that does not mean you actually have to file your 19 returns ahead of the new deadline.
Thanks, Dave. We have about a good group of questions, so almost like 15 questions coming right behind. Are you okay with timing and everything?
Sure, that's fine. I'm
Okay.
good. We can probably not Monday, but I'm good today.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, so she has a question behind it about the EIDL loan.
Yeah.
If you request and are approved for the emergency disbursement amount issued within 72 hours of your EIDL loan being processed, is that the amount considered a grant or an advance on your requested loan amount?
So under the EIDL program that I talked a little bit about, the first $10,000 under that program that a business receives is a grant. So it does not need to be repaid. It does, however, have a bearing on the amount of a PPP loan that you could apply for. So let me explain. Businesses can apply for both a PPP loan, which is payroll oriented, and an EIDL loan, which is available for other expenses beyond those few items that are authorized under PPP. So you can get both. The only requirement is, in terms of how the two programs interact, is you under EIDL get a $10,000 grant as the first part of your loan. That needs to be deducted from the loan amount you can apply for under PPP, because the government is essentially trying to avoid double dipping, getting a grant for certain costs that you would also get a PPP loan for.
Thanks, Dave. So we have another question from Paula Cantini. She's asking, so as a result of the imposed government shutdowns, I've been currently laid off all of my staff. My hope is to receive the PPP. However, has there been any thought to how this will impact employers' UC rate going forward?
That's an area where I don't have the expertise, nor have I done any research on. What I can discuss briefly is a common question or comment that's come up, and that is, with the federal government providing basically an enhancement to the unemployment compensation of $600 a week for those individuals, for those employees that have been laid off. There has been a lot of commentary around, my employees are making just as much money on unemployment with the federal enhancement as they would if I brought them back on payroll. The answer to that is, from a theoretical perspective, if an individual is offered their job back, i.e. because their employer has received a PPP loan and has the money to put them back on payroll, and they refuse, they're not eligible for unemployment. So that's an overlooked theme, I think, that how that'll be enforced, if and how that'll be enforced, I don't know the answer to that. But theoretically, if you as an employer get a PPP loan and have the money to bring your people back on payroll at their full compensation level, which will allow you to get the forgiveness under the program, and they refuse, they're violating the unemployment provision.
Thanks again, Dave. We do want to make an announcement to everyone on the Zoom chat as well as the video conferencing. We had a question from one of our participants, and we will be sending out this recording, or rather it will be posted on our website. The question behind that comes from Brianna McCoy. She's asking, if businesses have to hire additional employees, will they be included in the PPP calculation?
They have to hire additional employees. So
Yeah.
the concept here is that you bring your number of employees and their compensation levels back to pre-COVID levels. Paycheck protection. In terms of needing to bring more employees on, that's not the intent of the program. The intent of the program is to allow you to bring them back to the pre-COVID level. Just thinking through the question, if you need to bring on additional employees because your business is currently growing that significantly, that is where a PPP loan, perhaps in conjunction with a regular bank line of credit or financing for the incremental new employees, might make sense. Because obviously, if you're bringing on additional employees, in most cases, that means you're growing and should be able to repay conventional debt for the growth aspect.
Okay, thank you for that, Dave. We have a question from Vicky Giddens. She's asking, I have 3 businesses and only received money for one. I was told that I had to do separate applications for the other 2. Can I get PPP for the other businesses?
Yes, you can get a PPP loan for each individual business that has a separate tax ID number. You cannot commingle businesses under the same application, or no more than one business can receive the PPP loan. So if you have multiple, you'd have to apply for each of them separately.
Okay. We have a question from Kimberly Mina. Her question is, will you accept PPP applications from outside this region?
No, that is one area where, even though we're willing to work with non-existing clients, as I mentioned, we're expecting to develop a relationship with those clients, and for us to effectively administer a relationship means we need to, post-COVID world, we need to be able to service them, and that means about a 3-hour radius of Pittsburgh, where in Allison Park, where our office. So Western PA, Eastern Ohio, Northern West Virginia, yes, but beyond that, no.
Okay. And I guess her follow-up questions to that were, what if you operate a seasonal business, and how will this apply to employees if you didn't have any, and if you had expanded to hire 2 additional employees for upcoming summer, fall seasons?
Okay, so for seasonal employers, the look-back period to determine your loan amount is either February 15th through June 30th, 2019, or, and don't ask me why this is in the law, or March 1st, 2019 through June 30th. So instead of looking at the entire year of 2019, for seasonal businesses, you just look at that snapshot between either mid-February or the beginning of March and the end of June. The concept being that if you look at that same period last year versus where we're at right now this year, if it's a seasonal business, the seasons normally match up from year to year. You can, as a seasonal business, just use that piece of last year that corresponds to this year. I've had a question come up with a seasonal business that really doesn't start generating a lot of payroll until the fall of the year, because there happened to be a business that ramps up for the holiday rush. The concept here of PPP is we're trying to help businesses pay people during the shutdown, during the effects of COVID. Now, who knows? Nobody has a crystal ball, but next fall, where the concept is, would be back to some semblance of normalcy, where those businesses that have the heavy payroll needs beyond this time of year won't need this type of support. Or maybe they will. If things last longer, if things come back, there could be another iteration of this program in the fall.
And one more thing, Dave, how does this loan program work if you're operating out of your business? Well, if you're operating your business out of your home as opposed to leasing?
The only impact there is, if you're operating out of your home, you won't be able to pay yourself for that. And what I mean by that is rent is an authorized use of the proceeds under PPP, but it's rent to third parties. So if you're operating out of your home, that the only impact is you're not going to get to spend the money on the rent component. But other than that, it doesn't matter if you're home-based or not.
Thanks again for that answer, Dave. Looks like we have our final question, and it's coming from Paula Cantini. She's asking, if you have part-time employees whose hours may vary, how would you compensate these employees if you receive PPP funds? And what is the average number of hours?
So let's talk in two different aspects here. So in terms of the eligibility up front for the program, it's based on that 500 employee number is based on total headcount. So there was no requirements for aggregating part-time hours into full-time equivalent for the upfront eligibility. For the forgiveness aspect of the program, our understanding, again, because we don't have all the regs yet on forgiveness, our understanding is that part-time individuals' hours will be aggregated to full-time equivalents at the 30-hour mark. So 30 hours or more are considered full-time. You would aggregate your part-time employees' hours divided by 30 to determine your FTE. And where that has an impact, as I mentioned, there is a provision in the forgiveness that you have to maintain levels of employment and compensation. That's where FTEs will come in. So that's where the part-time hours need to be aggregated and calculated versus what they were last year.
Okay. We did have two more questions. As soon as I said, I thought that was our final question, right? A little bit of Murphy's Law. We got a question from Caroline Martin that says, have you started with the applications? My bank told me that they have not received the go-ahead from the SBA as of yet.
As I mentioned, we and banks are doing this differently. Most banks that I've talked to, including us, are putting internal queues together so that we basically have the applications ready to submit through the SBA online portal as soon as they open that up, which is contingent on the new funding being signed off by the president and whatever mechanics need to be done. There may be some banks out there that are just not accepting applications until the SBA funding is restored. That is not what I've heard is the norm, but each bank has its discretion.
Okay. And we have a question that came in from Derek Coleman. He's asking, is there a hierarchy to applications from different banks, or is it still first come, first serve for the second round?
This is a political hot button, meaning we did the only prioritization that we did here at Enterprise was we prioritized our existing clients before new clients. But for those existing clients and for this round 2 new clients, we're doing first in, first out. We felt the fairest way to do it. There has been some rumors and criticisms that other banks are prioritizing things in different ways. I can't speak for any other banks other than us. I just can tell you our MO here is first in, first out. Now that we've taken care of our existing clients in the first round.
Understandable. We had another question come in from Denise Mann. She's asking, can I submit an application to your bank even though I'm not a customer?
Yes, as I mentioned, all we're requiring is a good faith commitment on the part of the business owner that post-COVID and post-PPP, that you would transition your banking and any other lending relationship to us in due time.
Thank you, Dave. It looks like that was the last question that came in. Juan, do you want to add a little something before we step off the Zoom call?
Sure. I apologize if I'm on the delay. It seems like I'm a little bit behind. But first, I want to thank Dave, and I just want to thank Enterprise Bank as well for being a great resource partner for Riverside. And again, I just want to reiterate, this is our Boost Your Business webinar series. And if anyone has any other suggestions on topics that they would like for us to put together, please feel free to reach out to any of our staff. I'm sure by the looks of the companies that came on here, you received emails from various staff members from RCI. So please feel free to reach out. And I just wanted to reiterate, maybe since Dave's still here, I know some folks, their employees are rather file for unemployment than to come back to their firms. So I don't know how companies are dealing with that issue because of the additional $600 if they laid their employees off. They may choose not to come back as being hired because they're going to get paid more. Is there anything suggestions to that, to any business on that? I think that might be an issue moving forward.
Just what I had mentioned during the Q&A, that, quite honestly, if an employee is offered their position back because their employers receive PPP funds to bring them back, and they refuse, they're technically not eligible for unemployment.
And just one final thing, I thought about this earlier today, is when companies take this funds and they put it recorded on their financial statements, how is Enterprise Bank looking at that as a potential loan down the road? Are they going to look at it as additional loan, but because of it being under these circumstances, maybe you guys haven't even gotten there yet?
We haven't, but we're anticipating and advising and coaching all of our clients that this is really a grant program, and they should work as hard as possible to have as much as possible forgiven. The nice thing is they are unsecured, so there's no collateral, so it's not going to interfere from a collateral perspective with future borrowings if they do have a portion of this that they have to pay back over 2 years at 1%. There's no personal guarantees on it. But it will have a cash flow impact if it's not forgiven that we're going to have to look at.
So we did get a few questions that came in as you guys were speaking. So, this is good. So Paula Contini asking, do you have to recall all of your employees that have been laid off?
75% of them to get the forgiveness.
75%. Okay. And Lucille Plummer had a question in terms of, if you get denied, how soon can you apply again?
That's an interesting question, because quite honestly, we have not denied anybody unless they were ineligible. And if they're ineligible, they're ineligible. So, the only time that we haven't gotten in the first round before the funding ran out, that we didn't get them approved and funded, is if they never got us the required paperwork and supporting documentation we needed to process it. But the only way that there would be a denial, assuming the business owner provides all the necessary supporting info, is if they're not eligible, and that's not going to change from round 1 to round 2.
Dave, I had a question that came up in another session I was in, and the speaker couldn't answer. Do you know, obviously this is a new loan, but maybe based on experience with the SBA in the past, if people who receive these loans might be more likely to get audited or face other sorts of government restrictions on their activities?
That's the big fear that the banking community has. And probably one of the reasons why, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think it's important. One of the reasons why I think a lot of banks weren't as quick to get the money out as they could have been in phase one is because those of us that have done SBA lending for a long time know there's a fairly high standard in terms of documentation around government guaranteed loans. And this was introduced had very little guidance. So a lot of banks were very concerned. The forgiveness aspect of this is even more concerning, not just for the banks, but for business owners to, what level of auditing or documentation review the government's going to require. Again, when we get the guidance on forgiveness, which by law we should have by Monday, hopefully we'll flesh some of that out. But we're advising our clients to err on the side of caution in any of these circumstances. So anything that they may question whether it's going to be an authorized use of the funds for the forgiveness, don't spend it on that. If you do spend it on authorized, document. The one thing I can tell you that I've advised clients, and it's just common sense to me and hasn't come out anywhere in writing, is, if you're representing like these Schedule Cs I talked about, they have to have their accountant draft one for 2019 to base their loan on, even if they haven't filed their income tax return for 2019. Common sense tells me when you file that income tax return, those numbers better be the same as the ones that you used when you applied for PPP. But we're hoping, because of the need for speed that this program had, that they'll be more lenient than they are on their normal programs in terms of auditing on the back end. But only time will tell.
Thanks. And then one of our colleagues who was on the call asked if I could remind everyone to sign up for the Diversity Business Resource Center, which we run at Riverside Center for Innovation, if you're not already signed up. And you can do that by going to dbrcpittsburgh.org. We'll put that in the chat and also send it out when we send the link to the video. But if you sign up for that, that's a great way to make sure that you're informed about upcoming webinars that we're holding. Anything else from Juan or James?
We just want to extend a big thank you to you, Dave. This was a great session. We're receiving all positive feedback from the chat saying thank you so much. This has been the most informative session. Thank you so much. Thank you for the webinar. It was very helpful. And just people just echoes those sentiments. So we just want to say thank you. We're glad that we were able to kind of continue to move with the third part of this Boost Your Business series provided by Riverside Center for Innovation. And we want everybody to stay healthy and stay safe.
All right. Thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.